You sit in silence, your breath still in the dark corners of the room, a quiet shiver running down your spine. It is a presence you can feel, a whisper just beyond your grasp. It calls to you, as it once called to the ancient priests and scribes. Echoing from the corners of history, lost in the folds of time, it is a name long forgotten that stirs the air. Resheph, the plague god. Resheph's name has been erased from the sacred texts, lost in the shadows of the Bible, hidden like a cursed secret. Let's get started with today's story. But it is there, if you listen carefully, in the fleeting whispers of history, in the echoes of plagues that ravaged ancient cities. Once a powerful god of pestilence, a god who ruled over sickness, death, and destruction. Resheph has been cast aside, buried under layers of more palatable gods. The plague god was no longer welcome in a world that sought to forget him. His name was erased, but his power remained. As you delve into the dark corners of history, the truth begins to form a god hidden in plain sight. The sacred texts that guide millions today once contained his name, but it was buried, deliberately excised. This is the tale of a deity whose influence still lingers in the world. His power still touches lives, even though his name is no longer spoken aloud. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment, for this journey into the void must be shared and its story must be passed on. The gods cannot be forgotten again. The plague god waits, forgotten, but never truly gone. You will walk through the doors of this lost history, uncovering the forbidden and uncovering the lost knowledge that could change everything. And if you listen carefully enough, you can still hear the echo of Resheph's curse, still feel the weight of his forgotten power. You feel the presence growing, heavy and dense, like an invisible fog wrapping around you. The ancient texts, with their careful omissions and silences, cannot escape the truth. Resheph was once there, in those verses, in those words hidden. This is no ordinary story. This is not just the tale of a god erased from memory. Before we begin this descent into the shadows of forgotten gods, take a moment. Resheph, the plague god hidden in the Bible, an untold tale. A mystery that never should have been erased, yet has remained hidden. The air grows thick as you sink deeper into the shadows, where forgotten gods and long-forgotten truths dwell. There was a time when Resheph was known far and wide. He was not a god of simple rage or tempestuous storms, no. Resheph was the god of pestilence, a bringer of sickness and suffering, a god whose very presence heralded death in the form of fever, boils, and infection. In the ancient world, his name was spoken with dread, yet also with reverence. He was a god whose touch could wither a body, a god who could silence an entire city with the spread of a single plague. Instead, it lingers in the background, like the slow creep of fever in the body, unnoticed until it overwhelms. Something ancient is awakening, but not in a way that can be heard or understood. In every fever, in every plague, in every shadow of illness that passes through the world, the plague god's silent mark is there. You may never see it, but you feel it nonetheless. And you wonder, perhaps this silent presence is more terrifying than any god who speaks aloud. Resheph's touch does not speak in words, it speaks in the language of sickness, of death, of forgotten suffering. There is no dramatic entry, no grand return, only the quiet suffering that creeps in like an invisible hand. It is a god whose influence cannot be measured by grand temples or great rituals, but rather by the smallest of signs, the faintest tremor of illness, in a world that pretends to have forgotten him. Yet now, there are no offerings at his altar, no invocations whispered at the edges of the night. The world has moved on. Resheph has been erased, his temples forgotten, his name erased from memory. In these cities where merchants traded and kings ruled, the plague god was invoked in times of great suffering. When fever ravaged the land, when pestilence swept through the streets, the people would call on Resheph to either destroy or alleviate their torment. He was both a scourge and a savior. His name carried with it a weight that no other god could bear. When the first signs of disease appeared, priests would perform rituals, first as to appease him in hopes of either stopping the plague or shifting its wrath to another. But even as his worship was extinguished, the scent of his presence lingers in the air like the faintest trace of decay. The plague god, once feared, now lies dormant, a memory almost forgotten. Yet the plagues, the suffering, they persist. The waves of sickness that still creep through human history, could they be the forgotten echo of Resheph's touch? Of a God whose power has never truly left? You think back to the cities that once feared him: Tyre, Sidon, and Ugarit, places where Resheph was revered as a deity of power. But who remembers those ancient rituals now? The world has changed. Perhaps it is in the moments of deepest despair, when sickness strikes without warning, that you are reminded of Resheph's eternal presence. He may no longer be worshipped in the temples, but his power remains in the fevered dreams of the sick, in the cold sweat that drips down the brow of a suffering soul. His touch is silent, yet ever present, reminding you that even gods long forgotten do not truly fade away. They wait in the shadows, in the corners of human consciousness, ever ready to return when the world falters. There is a certain silence in Resheph's power. It does not shout, does not proclaim itself with fanfare. You feel the chill that runs up your spine, as if in the air around you there is a faint stirring. In this world, perhaps you will never hear Reshep's name uttered aloud again. But his touch, his presence, it is with you. The Bible, revered by billions, its pages turned and its words recited without question. But deep within its verses, hidden in plain sight, there are whispers, tiny fragments of truths long buried, waiting for a soul daring enough to unearth them. The story of Resheph is one such whisper. Scholars have long debated the meaning of this passage, its cryptic nature causing confusion and curiosity. Why, you wonder, would a god of pestilence be mentioned in a book so filled with divine morality, with the righteous struggle against evil? Why would the text speak of disease and plague if not to hint at something more? Even in the pages of the most sacred text, the plague god lingers. He is not gone. He is merely concealed, as if by divine decree. The verse, the subtle hints, as if the Bible itself carries the weight of forgotten gods, each one lurking beneath the surface, waiting for someone to uncover the truth. Resheph's touch is not just confined to ancient history or to the streets of ancient cities. It has bled into the sacred texts, into the very words that have shaped civilization. His presence is hidden, but it is there, woven into the fabric of the world's most revered scriptures. His legacy is not one that can be silenced, not one that can be forgotten. Resheph, it seems, was never truly gone. It's as if the sacred text is hiding not just stories of salvation, but the remnants of something older, something darker. The Bible may speak of a single, omnipotent God, but there are traces, tiny whispers that suggest Resheph was never truly erased. He has merely been kept in the shadows. You feel a pull to keep reading, to keep searching, knowing that more truths lie hidden within the sacred scriptures, buried beneath centuries of interpretation and alteration. His name does not appear plainly. No grand verse proclaims his presence. Yet if you look close enough, you will find his shadow. How many whispers are there, waiting to be uncovered by those who dare to listen to the stories that the world has long forgotten? The plague is described, its swift and indiscriminate nature, capturing the essence of Resheph himself. A God who does not seek to be known by name, who slips through the cracks of history, casting his shadow on every disease that spreads. This is no accidental mention. This is a deliberate inclusion, a hidden testament to a God who once reigned supreme in the ancient world. You sit, breath held as you delve into the sacred text. The Old Testament, a tapestry of stories stitched together over millennia, contains more than its fair share of gods, kings, and wars. Yet amid the words of Moses, of Abraham, and of the Exodus, there lies a verse brief, almost too fleeting to notice. You can almost hear the distant rustling of pages, the soft murmurs of a forgotten world. Perhaps Resheph's name, once known, was deliberately obscured by those who sought to eliminate him from the divine narrative, who wished to create a world where only the benevolent gods of healing and salvation would reign. Perhaps it was too dangerous to acknowledge a god like Resheph, a god whose power was both feared and revered, a god whose very nature embodied the chaotic, untamable forces of life and death. It is in a passage that speaks of pestilence, of sickness descending upon a land, and the divine response to it. The verse does not name Resheph directly, no, that would have been too obvious, but there, hidden beneath the layers of sacred allegory, is a reference to a god of destruction, a god of illness. In this forgotten verse, you can feel Reshep's presence, though his name is not written. Perhaps it is no coincidence that this mention was so subtle. The passage hints at something greater, the uncomfortable truth that the gods who rule over sickness, disease, and death cannot be entirely erased. And so, the question lingers. How many other gods, like Resheph, have been obscured within the sacred texts? Their names erased, but their influence still lingering in the subtext? There is something unnerving in this discovery. As you sit with this discovery, the weight of it presses against you. There are places in the world where the divine and the forbidden meet, where worship is not clean, not sanctioned, not approved by the authorities who claim to understand the divine will. In these places, in the depths of ancient temples and hidden shrines, Resheph was not just a distant memory. He was a god who demanded offerings, sacrifices, and rituals that few dared to speak of. These rites were whispered about, shared only in the dead of night, in the fear-laden corners of the world. The most disturbing of these rites involved sacrifice, not just of animals, but of the sick. A man or woman afflicted by the plague would be brought before the altar, their body ravaged by the disease. The priests of the more accepted gods, the ones who held sway over cities and kingdoms, feared Resheph's rites because they were too wild, too unmanageable. As the centuries passed, did they vanish hidden in the fringes of history, or were they hunted down, eradicated by the forces of order and faith? What became of those who dared to call upon the god of plague when the world turned its back on it? He is a god who was never truly abandoned. He was only driven into the shadows, where his name is still whispered, where his followers still pray in silence, their offerings to the plague god, a testament to his enduring power. Perhaps even today, there are those who practice these ancient rites in secret, hidden in the shadows of the world, knowing the risks, but also knowing the immense power that comes from invoking a god like Resheph. The clean rituals of prayer and sacrifice were seen as pure, while those of Resheph were tainted by death, disease, and impurity. Their rituals may have been forbidden, but they were not eradicated. They persist, hidden beneath the surface of civilization, like a slow-burning fire waiting to break free. To embrace such a god was to be cast out, exiled from the community of righteous worshippers. Resheph's followers were marked as heretics, witches, and outcasts, reviled for their belief in the destructive force of the plague. To offer up the body in such a state, they believed, was to offer the very essence of the god. They were the ones who embraced what the world feared the most: disease, chaos, death. They were the true children of Resheph, the ones who held his name in their hearts, and who, in their devotion, welcomed suffering as a means of spiritual renewal. In their secret temples, in the hidden places of the world, they spoke his name in reverence, invoking his wrath, knowing that to be consumed by it was to become something otherworldly, and it wasn't only the sick who would suffer. Their bodies were often set alight as part of a purification ritual. The flames, they believed, would carry the soul of the offering straight to Resheph, to be consumed in the eternal fire, and thus ensure their place in the divine. His followers, those who still clung to his worship long after his name had been cast aside, understood the power of disease. They knew that Resheph was not a god of simple death, but a god of transformation. To call upon him was to embrace suffering, to open oneself to the ravages of fever and plague in hopes that it would cleanse, renew, and destroy. The followers of Resheph did not fear death, for they understood it as a passage, a necessary force to remake the world in a way the living could never comprehend. The forbidden rituals of Resheph's worship were complex and dark, a far cry from the clean, well-ordered prayers of the temple. As you sit in the stillness, a shiver runs down your spine. These were not the kinds of gods who loved their followers, not in the conventional sense. These gods demanded suffering. Resheph did not offer healing, he offered transformation. His worshippers believed that to bear his mark, the mark of pestilence, was to be touched by something ancient and powerful. In a strange way, they welcomed their sickness, for it meant they were chosen. Resheph was not a god who gave answers, nor did he promise salvation. His gift was chaos. He was not a god of cleanliness, but one of unrestrained force, an unstoppable wave of destruction. The irony lies in the nature of these rituals. They were forbidden. You think on this for a moment? The followers of Resheph lived in exile not just from the cities of men, but from the divine order itself. Wonder what happened to these secret worshippers of Resheph. In the silence, you can almost hear them, the secret followers of Resheph, whispering his name in forgotten temples, carrying his power into the world of the living. As you reflect on these forbidden rites, you understand that Resheph is not just a forgotten god. There is a peculiar kind of power in names. In the ancient world, a name was not just an identifier, it was an invocation, a binding spell that could shape the very essence of existence. His name was not meant to be uttered in casual prayer or in lighthearted conversation. His name was a secret, hidden in the tongues of those who knew what it meant to call upon the plague, to invite destruction and sickness into the world. To speak his name was to invite his touch, sometimes in the form of healing, sometimes in the form of death. It was a risk. His followers, those few who remained loyal, understood this intimately. It is not just the fear of death that he brings. It is the weight of knowing that the boundaries of the sacred, the profane, the forbidden, are not as clear as you once thought. A name can break all that you know, can tear apart the very fabric of belief itself. They knew that to utter Resheph's name was to summon his presence, and with it, the weight of his power. Resheph's name may have been hidden, erased, forgotten, but his power remains. Silent, potent, ever present. It waits for those who dare to listen, for those who dare to speak. It is because to acknowledge him, to speak his name aloud, is to admit that there are forces beyond human understanding, beyond control. Forces that do not fit into the clean and comfortable narrative of civilization. There are those who still call upon his name in whispers, in the dead of night, in secret rites that are hidden from the world. If you were to speak his name aloud, what would happen? Would you too be marked by Resheph, touched by his curse? Or would you be one of the fortunate few who escape his wrath? They know the danger and they embrace it. For there is power in that name, power in the ancient invocation of the plague god. The world does not want to remember Resheph, does not want to acknowledge that there are gods who bring death as easily as they bring life. And so, they erase him. They erase his name. They cast him out of the sacred texts and into the forgotten corners of history. To speak the name of a god was to call that god into being, to give it life and power. And in this world of ancient deities, Resheph's name was one that was feared above all others. Resheph was not a god who could be called upon lightly. You wonder what it would be like to say his name aloud. What would it feel like to be in the presence of the plague god, to have his dark power reach out and touch you? Ancient records tell of those who dared to utter it, only to be struck down by fever, to fall ill with diseases that no healer could cure. It was as if the very sound of his name could tear open the fabric of the world, bringing plague and suffering in its wake. In the cities where Resheph was once worshipped, the very mention of his name was forbidden by the priests of more accepted gods. Those who were caught uttering it were cast out, branded as heretics, cursed by the very god they had tried to invoke. Would you tremble with fear, knowing what his touch could bring? Or would you be drawn in, as so many before you had been, by the strange allure of the unknown? But to speak his name was not without consequence. Even the Bible, that revered text, has hidden Resheph's name away, though it lingers like a ghost in the margins. It is as if there is an unspoken agreement that certain things should not be said, should not be remembered. And yet, even in the silence, even in the fear of uttering his name, Resheph's influence persists. The plague does not need to be named to exist. It simply is. You can almost feel it now, the weight of Resheph's presence hanging in the air like a thick fog. Perhaps this is why Resheph's name was erased, why his worship was hidden away. It is not just because of the suffering he brings. But even now, even in the quiet darkness, there are those who still remember. You wonder, as you sit in this stillness, whether you too are susceptible to the lure of the forbidden. In the end, it is not just a matter of speaking the name. It is a matter of knowing it, of understanding the weight it carries. You walk through the hallowed halls of history, where ink and parchment have borne the weight of countless stories, secrets, and divine declarations. Sacred texts, these holy relics of civilizations past, hold within them the narratives that shape the world. But what if these texts, these sacred vessels of truth, have been corrupted? What if the gods once boldly written have been intentionally erased, their names stripped from the pages? Resheph, the plague god, It's but one example of a divine figure who was silenced by the powerful hands that wielded these texts. To mention a god like Resheph in such a context would have disrupted the image of a single, benevolent God in control of all things. And so, Resheph was hidden. His name was removed from the pages. The corruption of sacred texts is not merely the story of the loss of one God's name. What other gods, what other truths have been erased or transformed to fit a new world order? The very act of corruption, of redaction, reveals something much more profound: the need to control belief, to shape the narrative, to ensure that the gods who rise are those that serve the will of the rulers, the priests, the scribes. And now, as you sit in this quiet darkness, his name is still there, written between the lines, waiting for someone to see what has been lost. It is the story of many gods lost to time, erased to protect the integrity of new beliefs. How many other deities, once revered and feared, have been cast into the shadows in the same manner as Resheph? How many once powerful gods have been silenced by those who wrote history? The mention of pestilence was not entirely excised. Of course, plagues were still referenced, but always as the work of a god in control. The fury of destruction was always tied to the will of the one true God, never to the erratic, unpredictable forces embodied by Resheph. And as you sit with this knowledge, you feel the weight of Resheph's forgotten name pressing against your chest. The plague god may have been erased, but his absence tells you something far more powerful than any direct mention ever could. He remains buried in the text, a shadow that cannot be exorcised. There are those who believe that Resheph's mention in ancient scriptures was no accident. Some scholars suggest that his name still lingers in the text, disguised beneath the veil of other words. The Hebrew Bible, for example, mentions diseases, plagues, and pestilences, terms that resonate with the ancient nature of Resheph. Though his name is not present in the clear form it once was. The presence of his essence can be felt in the way plagues are depicted as a form of divine retribution. They claim that the mention of his name was there once, but somewhere along the way, it was removed. With each passing generation, the version of the sacred text we read today has become more sanitized, more palatable to the prevailing theology. As kings and emperors, priests and scholars sought to solidify their own visions of the divine order, the influence of certain gods was erased, and with it, any mention of their once vibrant power. The Bible, as it exists today, is a product of centuries of editing, translation, and redaction. The earliest manuscripts, long buried in the sands of time, tell of a world filled with gods of varying domains, gods of war, gods of love, gods of wisdom, and yes, gods of plague. But as the centuries passed, these names began to fade. Some were merely softened, their power diminished. Others, like Resheph, were entirely removed, as if the very act of acknowledging their existence would threaten the carefully constructed order of faith. It is here, in the stillness of these ancient texts, that a hidden truth begins to emerge. Some scholars, those daring enough to probe the depths of forgotten history, argue that the name of Resheph was intentionally excised from the text by those who feared his influence. His name, they claim, was deliberately erased to protect the fragile narratives of salvation that the faithful clung to. The very presence of a god like Resheph, embodiment of chaos, destruction, and disease, was too much for the world that sought to portray a divinely ordered universe. In the world of the Bible, as the worship of one god rose above the rest, the notion of other divine forces was seen as a threat. But was Resheph's mention really erased, or did it simply become too obscure to be recognized? In these subtle clues, in these veiled references, you begin to understand something unsettling. And so, you wonder, what else has been hidden? Is corruption, is hiddenness? Is not just an accident of time, it is a deliberate action to erase the inconvenient truths of the past. In the end, Resheph was never truly gone. He was hidden by those who would never dare let him return, lest his chaotic and unpredictable power resurface. The air is thick with dust, the scent of the old world still lingering in the corners of the mind. The Exodus, that great migration from the land of Egypt to the promised land of Canaan, is often seen as a tale of freedom, a moment of divine intervention, but beneath its surface, something darker stirs. He was part of the pantheon of deities worshipped by the ancient Egyptians, a god whose power was felt in every epidemic, in every wave of sickness that ravaged the land. The gods who had once been worshipped in Egypt did not vanish with the Israelites' departure. They lingered in the land, their power still felt in the air, in the diseases that followed in the wake of the Israelites' flight. It was a spiritual exile as well, a forced severing of ties from the gods of the old world, from the ancient worship that had once defined them. The land they had come to possess was not empty, nor was it free from the gods of the old world. It was teeming with remnants of ancient worship, with rites that did not belong to the new faith. Resheph, the god of plague, may have been exiled with the rest of the forgotten gods, but his shadow never truly left. But the old gods, including Resheph, are never truly gone. They are exiled, yes, but always present, always watching, waiting for the moment when their power will once again be acknowledged. It lingers in the corners of history, a reminder that even the gods who are erased from memory do not disappear. They wait in silence, in the forgotten places, in the spaces between worlds, ever ready to return when the world falters. These were the gods of Canaan, the gods of fertility, of war, and of pestilence. Resheph's influence was not completely erased. It was simply shifted, transformed, hidden behind the masks of new deities. In the shadow of the Israelites' new faith, the old gods still whispered in the winds, still haunted the land, waiting for the right moment to return. And yet, even as they crossed into their new homeland, the Israelites did not find freedom from the old gods. They found only a new set of beliefs, a new order imposed upon them by their newfound faith. But what about the gods they had once known? What about the forgotten gods who had once ruled the land, like Resheph? While the worship of these gods was abandoned by the people of Israel, their presence remained, a haunting reminder of what had been left behind. He was not the god of life, nor of fertility, but of destruction, a reminder of the fragility of existence. They fled Egypt, but they could not escape what they had left behind. Resheph, too, was exiled, not by physical boundaries, but by the boundaries of faith, by the changing tides of religion. His name was no longer spoken, his worship no longer practiced, but his power, his influence, remained. Even in the land of the promised inheritance, for even in the promised land, there were plagues, diseases that swept through the people, tests of faith and endurance that seemed almost too coincidental. And it is here, in this land that had once been sacred to other gods, that Resheph's influence continued to haunt the Israelites. And yet, as the Israelites marched towards freedom, they left behind more than just their Egyptian captors. They left behind the gods of Egypt, including Resheph. The Israelites, the chosen people, fled from Egypt, a land once teeming with gods, each one with its own domain, its own wrath and favor. But as they moved forward, crossing seas and deserts, they left behind not just their homes, but a part of their spiritual history, gods who had once been worshipped in secret, in the shadows, in places forgotten. Among these forgotten gods was Resheph, the god of plague, whose presence had once been felt in the land of Egypt. But the Exodus did not mark the end of Resheph's influence. Cannot help but wonder if Resheph followed them. His power had crossed the desert with the Israelites, weaving its way into the fabric of their journey. But there is more to the Exodus than just the physical journey. As the Israelites settled in the land of Canaan, they encountered a strange and uncomfortable truth. There is something tragic in this exile of the gods. In the way the Israelites turned away from their past and sought to erase all traces of the old world. And so, the gods of the old world continued to linger in the shadows, waiting for those who dare to remember them, to call upon them once more. As you sit in the quiet aftermath of this thought, you realize that the Exodus was not just a journey from slavery to freedom, it was a journey from one set of gods to another. The land of Canaan, bathed in the warmth of the sun and lush with promise, was not as empty as the Israelites had hoped. It was a land filled with ancient spirits, the echoes of gods who had once ruled the people who dwelt there. As the Israelites made their way into this new land, the power of their own faith wrestled with the unseen forces that had long been a part of it. And among these forces, hidden in the shadows of their beliefs, was Resheph, the god of pestilence, a god whose presence could never be fully erased. At first, it seemed as though the Israelites had escaped the grasp of the plagues that had once ravaged Egypt. It is said that Resheph's power did not reveal itself in grand displays of fire and fury. No, his power was more subtle. They had left Egypt behind, But perhaps they had not left the curses of Egypt, the gods of Egypt, behind with it. Resheph's plague was not one that could be escaped by physical distance. His influence stretched across borders, through time and through belief. The presence of Resheph was undeniable, even though his name was never spoken. His influence can still be felt today in the smallest of ways. It was simply the next chapter in the long, ongoing saga of gods who were never meant to be erased. The question lingers in the back of your mind: how many more forgotten gods continue to haunt the world? How many gods, like Resheph, have left their mark on the land, their power still woven into the fabric of our existence? Hidden in the diseases we suffer, in the sicknesses we cannot explain, the gods we choose to forget do not disappear. They simply fade into the cracks of history, waiting for a time when they can return. It is said that in the quietest moments, when the people sat in their tents and whispered about their suffering, they could feel his presence. It was a strange, unsettling feeling. The sensation of being watched by something ancient, something powerful, yet also something that had no place in their new world. The land of Canaan, it seemed, had not been cleansed of its old gods, and Resheph's power was still deeply embedded in the very soil. The plague god's touch was always there, lingering just beneath the surface of their new faith, always waiting to reassert itself when the world was at its most vulnerable. It crept in like the faintest touch of fever, like the sickly feeling of a body on the verge of collapse. They offered sacrifices, performed rituals, and prayed for healing. Yet, despite their efforts, the disease would not leave. It seemed as though the land itself had been stained by the touch of an ancient god one who had been cast out, yet whose influence could never truly be severed. It was the kind of plague that left no mark on the skin. It was in these moments of doubt, in the midst of illness and death, that the power of Resheph truly showed itself. For his influence was not in grand acts of violence, but in the slow, insidious unraveling of certainty, in the quiet erosion of faith. The Israelites were not only suffering from physical illness, they were suffering from the deeper spiritual affliction of doubt. Could their new God truly protect them from the plagues, or had they been abandoned? Were they to live forever with the shadow of Resheph looming over them? It took root in the soul, leaving behind a kind of spiritual decay that no amount of prayer could cure. Their journey had been long and arduous, but they had crossed the desert, had crossed the sea, and now they were on the cusp of settling into the land they had been promised. But the gods of the old world do not relinquish their hold easily. Though the people of Israel had left behind Egypt, they could not leave behind the gods of Egypt, gods who had shaped their lives in ways they had yet to understand. And so it began. Strange sicknesses swept through the camp, pestilence that seemed to spring from nowhere, unseen but all too real. Fevers, boils, and illnesses that had no cure haunted the people of Israel as they made their homes in the land of Canaan. As the Israelites struggled with the plagues, they turned to their new God for deliverance. But there were whispers in the dark corners of their camp. Whispers that spoke of the old gods, the gods of pestilence and disease, the gods who had been left behind. The people began to wonder, was this the wrath of the one true God? Was it something older, something that had followed them from Egypt, from the land of the pharaohs? The answer, though hidden, was clear to those who knew the forgotten gods. Resheph had followed them, his influence lingering in the very air they breathed. Resheph's power was not just in his ability to cause death, but in his ability to transform, to bring about the kind of chaos that forces a people to question their very beliefs. The people of Israel, in their attempts to forge a new identity, began to turn their backs on the ancient ways, but the ways they had rejected were not easily forgotten. As the plagues continued to ravage their ranks, the Israelites began to wonder if the land of Canaan was truly the land they had been promised. In time, the priests of Israel, those who held the divine knowledge of their God, worked tirelessly to cleanse the people of the sickness that plagued them. The people's faith was tested, their resolve shaken. This question, though never fully answered, lingered in the air just as the sicknesses did. The plagues were not the only mark Resheph left on the land. And as you sit, the weight of this knowledge pressing on your chest, you realize that the land of Canaan, the promised land, was never truly free from the old gods. The forgotten gods are not merely lost in time, they are etched in stone, carved into the very foundations of the world. The stories of Resheph, though obscured by the sands of history, were not always hidden. There are relic symbols strewn across ancient lands that still bear the mark of his presence. It is not the kind of image one would associate with the clean, orderly rituals of the accepted gods of Israel, nor with the gods of peace and prosperity. No, this symbol carries with it the essence of something darker, something wilder. They understood that death, that plague, that sickness were not things to be feared but to be embraced. A threshold between the world of the living and the world of the gods. The stone once used in sacred rites now lies in fragments, scattered across the earth. And though the priests of the accepted faiths may scoff at its significance, the stone still holds its power. It whispers the old truths, the forgotten rites, to those who are brave enough to listen. Even the most careful attempts to erase a god's presence cannot fully erase it. Resheph, though his name was cast aside, still has a hold on the world. His influence remains in the symbols, in the stones, in the whispers of those who dare to remember. The ancient heretics knew this, and that is why they carried the symbol with them wherever they went. What became of the heretics who worshipped Resheph in secret, who carved his mark into their homes, into their bodies, into their hearts? Were they hunted down, destroyed by the forces of order, or did they fade into obscurity, their rites forgotten, their sacrifices erased from memory? It was not merely a mark of worship, it was a protection, a sign that they had made a pact with the forces beyond the veil, that they had accepted the touch of Resheph in exchange for a deeper understanding of life and death. For in the presence of suffering, there was transformation. To offer the body in the throes of fever, to surrender to the burning heat of a plague, was to experience the god's power directly. The stone, the symbol, was a way of marking that transformation, of acknowledging that the body, the soul, could be remade by the touch of Resheph. It is a reminder that even in times of peace, in times of salvation, the shadow of Resheph lingers, ready to reclaim what was once his. It is said that the heretics who once worshipped him carved these symbols into stones, into altars, into their very bodies, as a way of invoking his power, of marking their devotion to the plague god. But to those who have studied the old ways, who understand the subtle movements of forgotten gods, the stone speaks volumes. It is a map to a world that no longer exists, a world where gods like Resheph were once honored, where their presence was felt in every fevered breath, in every moment of suffering. Perhaps the stone still carries the same power it once did, waiting for the right person to find it, to unlock the knowledge it contains. The world may have erased Resheph's name, but it cannot erase the mark of his presence. The symbol remains, hidden in the corners of the earth, a reminder that some gods are not so easily forgotten. One such symbol is said to have been discovered in a forgotten temple in the hills of ancient Canaan, stone weathered and cracked, but unmistakably carved with the symbols of death, of fever, of plague. Some claim that it is the mark of Resheph himself. Others, though, are more cautious. They suggest that it may simply be a relic of a time long past, a symbol associated with death in general, not specifically the god who once ruled over it. But you know better. The mark speaks to you. It speaks with the quiet power of a long-forgotten truth. The symbol is both simple and intricate, a delicate intertwining of curves and lines that seem to form a pattern. A flow of energy, almost as if the stone itself is pulsing with the god's power. To the casual observer, the stone might seem like nothing more than a relic of an ancient time, a piece of forgotten art, a remnant of a lost civilization. The heretics who once worshipped Resheph knew something that the later generations would forget. The symbol itself is not just an artifact, it is a gateway. What remains today of the symbol of this heretical worship is a story left unfinished. But what of the people who once carried the stone? Perhaps you wonder, some of them still exist today. As you sit, contemplating the meaning of this forgotten symbol, you realize something disturbing. The gods have plagued those ancient forgotten figures who once ruled over disease, suffering, and death are not as easily dismissed as history would have you believe. They lurk in the corners of human history, their names and stories buried beneath the weight of time, their power obscured by more palatable deities, and yet there is something profoundly unsettling about them, something that makes their influence impossible to erase. Perhaps it is because the nature of plague itself is so deeply tied to the human experience. Plague is not just an affliction of the body, it is a reminder of the fragility of life, of how easily the world can shift from health to illness, from comfort to suffering. Why did the rise of monotheism, of more structured and orderly beliefs, lead to the disappearance of gods like Resheph? Was it because their power was too much for the world to bear, too unsettling to be acknowledged? Though their names have been erased, their power remains. The plagues, the diseases, the suffering, these are not just random events. They are reminders of something deeper, something older. They are gods of transformation, of change, of the inevitable forces that shape the world. They are a part of us, a part of the human condition, a reminder of our fragility and our mortality. Their presence in the world is not just a relic of the past, it is a part of the ongoing human story, a story of suffering, transformation, and rebirth. Perhaps it is because at our core, we all know that the world we live in is fragile, that our lives are precarious, and that disease, suffering, and death are not just distant concepts, but real forces that shape our world. The plague gods, with all their fear and chaos, remind us of this truth. They remind us that life is never as stable as we think it is, that death and disease are always lurking just beyond the veil of our understanding. The plague gods are not gone. They have simply taken a different form, lurking in the background, waiting for the moment when they will once again reveal themselves. Or was it because the forces they represented were simply too chaotic, too unpredictable for a world that sought order and control? The gods who preside over such transformations are not gods who offer easy answers. In a world that was already beset by disease, famine, and war, it was easier to focus on gods of healing, of protection, of salvation, rather than to confront the raw power of destruction and suffering that plague gods embodied. It was easier to cast aside the gods of death and decay, to create a more comforting narrative. One where the forces of the universe were under control, where the suffering of the world could be explained and understood in ways that made sense, but rather gods who force humanity to confront its deepest fears, the fear of death, the fear of disease, the fear of the unknown. Resheph, the plague god, is but one in a long line of gods whose domain was sickness, decay, and destruction. The real mystery is why their power has never fully disappeared. Why do these gods continue to haunt the world even in a time when their names are forgotten? What is it about them that keeps them alive, even when no one remembers their stories? Across the ancient world, from the temples of Egypt to the cities of Mesopotamia, there were gods who were called upon in times of great suffering. These were not gods who offered comfort or healing, but gods who ruled over the transformation of life into death. The passage from health to sickness, from order to chaos. And while the names of many of these gods have been forgotten, their presence is still felt in the world today, in the diseases and plagues that continue to ravage the human race. What is it about these plague gods that makes them so persistent, so difficult to erase from the human consciousness? And yet, for all the terror they inspire, these gods also embody something else, something deeply human. They represent the chaos of the world, the forces that lie beyond our understanding. They are the wildness that cannot be tamed, the destruction that cannot be prevented, the inevitable decay that awaits all living things. In a strange way, they are not merely figures of fear, but of inevitability. They remind us that life, in all its beauty and certainty, is always teetering on the edge of chaos. But why were these gods, these powerful, terrifying figures abandoned, erased from the records of history? Some scholars believe that the abandonment of plague gods like Resheph was not just a matter of changing religious beliefs. It was a matter of human fear. But perhaps the real mystery lies in the fact that these gods, once so feared and revered, continue to influence us today. As you think about this, you realize that the question of why the plague gods were abandoned is not the real mystery. Perhaps it is because the plague gods are not just gods of disease. And perhaps, in some way, this is why the plague gods will never truly fade. There are secrets in the blood, hidden truths that slumber deep within our veins. Now, for centuries, the human race has sought to understand the mysteries of life and death, but in the blood, the essence of the divine and the destructive has always existed, unacknowledged, unexplored. The connection between blood and plague is an ancient one. Blood was not merely seen as the lifeblood of the human body, but as the very conduit of divine power. The followers of Resheph knew that this blood, This vessel of sickness was sacred. Blood sacrifices were a common practice in many ancient cultures. The blood of animals, of humans, was offered to appease gods, to cleanse the land of evil, to ensure the protection and fertility of crops, to ward off disease. But in Resheph's worship, it was not just the blood of animals that was sacred. It was the blood of the plague-stricken, the diseased. The very affliction of the body became a conduit for divine power. The touch of Resheph is never far away. It lingers in the blood, in the sickness, in the transformation that comes with suffering. And perhaps, just perhaps, there are still those who remember the old ways, who know the power of the blood and the God it once invoked. The act of drinking it was not one of mere survival. It was a ritual of rebirth, a way of invoking Resheph's power into their own bodies. Blood is not merely a physical substance, it is a symbol of life, but also of death. To partake in such rituals was to expose oneself to the wrath of the god, and yet there are traces of this dark communion still present in the world. The blood remains a symbol of life and death, of suffering and transformation. Even in the modern world, we are still bound by the same truths that the ancients understood. The blood is the lifeblood of the human experience, a connection to the divine and the destructive, to that which we cannot control but can never fully escape. It was to invite the plague into your body, to risk becoming the very thing you sought to control. The followers of Resheph understood this fully. They knew that in offering their own blood, in drinking the blood of the sick, they were entering into a dangerous pact with the god. The power of Resheph could cleanse and renew, but it could also destroy. It is the one thing that connects all living beings, and it is through blood that life can be both created and destroyed. In Resheph's worship, blood was not only the mark of the plague, but the mark of transformation, of transcendence. To drink the blood of the sick was to embrace that which others feared, to walk in the shadow of death and come out reborn. This act was forbidden in the eyes of other faiths, of course, too raw, too unholy. But those who worshipped the plague god knew that only by embracing death could they find the true power of life. The blood was not just a sacrifice, it was a communion, a way to share in the god's destructive power. In ancient rituals, blood was both a symbol and a sacrifice. It was through blood that a god could be invoked, through blood that transformation could take place. And it is through blood that Resheph, the plague god, continued to manifest in the world long after his worship was abandoned. In the rituals of old, when the plague came, it was not just the body that suffered, the soul was involved too. The sickness, the fever that would seize a person, was believed to be a divine punishment or, conversely, a divine test. The sick, the diseased, those ravaged by fever, they were seen as living conduits to Resheph's power. To drink the blood of the plague-stricken was to drink the essence of the god himself, to become one with the power of destruction, to embrace the chaotic forces of death and rebirth. But beyond the sickness itself, it was the blood that was seen as the true vessel of the god's power. And in some rites, the blood of the sick was seen not as a sign of suffering, but as the very essence of divine communion. It is said that in ancient Canaan, Resheph's followers still whispered his name in the darkness of night. They believed that by consuming the blood of the afflicted, they could gain a closer connection to the god. In this blood was the god's fury, the fever that ravaged the body, the burning heat that could either heal or destroy. The idea of sacred blood is not exclusive to Resheph, of course. As you sit with this unsettling thought, you begin to understand the deeper implications of the blood in these ancient rites. And yet, as with all things sacred and forbidden, the blood carries with it a curse. Today, the blood rituals of Resheph are long forgotten, dismissed as ancient superstition. In the quietest moments, in the stillness of the night, you feel the faintest stir of something ancient, something deep within your own blood, something that stirs when you least expect it. The world turns, as it always has, and in its turning, it forgets. It forgets the names of gods long past, the rituals that once shaped civilizations, the power that once surged through blood and bone. And yet there are whispers, quiet, fleeting moments when the veil between the forgotten and the remembered is thin enough to allow a breath of ancient truth to slip through. Resheph, the plague god, the one whose name was erased from the sacred texts, still lingers in the quiet corners of the world, in the spaces between memory and oblivion. The plagues still come. They are not as grand as they once were, not as violent or terrifying. The more humanity strives for order, for control, the more the plague gods remain at the edges of consciousness, never fully vanishing, always ready to re-enter the world when the balance shifts. Feeling the weight of this knowledge press against you. It is not a promise of salvation, it is a warning. A warning that the world is never truly free from the gods of chaos, from the gods of plague. They wait in the shadows, in the corners of forgotten temples, in the blood of the sick, in the whispers of those who dare to remember. And when the world falters, when the balance shifts, they will rise again. The last whisper of Resheph is not just a call to remember, but a call to understand. To understand that the world we live in is not as orderly, not as controlled as we would like to believe. There are forces beyond our comprehension, forces that shape the world in ways we cannot see, cannot predict. And in the presence of sickness, in the quiet suffering of the body, there is a reminder that these forces are still at work. Still waiting for the moment when the veil between the past and present grows, thin enough for them to return. The belief in these gods may have been erased, but their essence remains like a dormant seed, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. The world may have moved on, but the power of the forgotten gods lingers in the air, in the shadows, in the very fabric of existence. Then you're probably ready for the next god. But they come nonetheless, in waves of sickness, in the subtle creep of disease through the body and the mind. And in those moments when the world feels as though it is slipping into chaos, there is a sense that something deeper is at play, is not just a random affliction of the body. No, the plagues are reminders, whispers from a time when the gods of destruction walked freely among men. In every epidemic, in every disease that sweeps through the world, there is a trace of Resheph's power. It is in the fever that burns in the bones, in the sickness that arrives without warning, in the helplessness that comes with the sudden realization that life is fragile, fleeting, and beyond control. The world may have tried to erase Resheph, to bury him beneath the weight of history, but he is not so icily forgotten. His influence is like a shadow that stretches across time, creeping into every corner of the world, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again. And so, the last whisper of Resheph is not one of power, not one of grand displays or divine fury. No, the last whisper is the quiet presence, the subtle reminder that the forces of chaos and destruction are never far away. The plague may not always strike in grand visible waves, but it is always there, lurking in the background, a force that cannot be completely erased. There is a certain irony in this. You sit quietly. The last whisper is not one of redemption, if your candle hasn't gone out. Through the veils of history, the face of Resheph has shifted. Twisted by time, by cultural upheavals, and by the ever-changing nature of belief. Once known in his raw form, a god of fever, disease, his fiery wrath swept through the land. Often depicted as a fierce, unstoppable force, in the dark recesses of history, he blended into figures like Typhon in Greek mythology, a god associated with chaos, destruction, and pestilence. Perhaps even in the more benevolent gods, like Apollo, Resheph's influence remained after all. Apollo was not only a god of healing, but also a god of disease. They evolve with the world, changing as the needs of the people change, as the stories of their worshippers evolve. Each culture that encountered him, each generation that feared him, has shaped him in their own image. Even now, when you think of Resheph, you are not thinking of the god as he was known in ancient texts. You are thinking of the modern world, where the echoes of his power are felt in every pandemic, in every sickness that suddenly sweeps through the world. He has become the face of every unseen disease, every affliction that humanity cannot fully understand. And in this way, he is immortal. His essence persists, disguised as something more familiar, more digestible to a world that cannot bear the full weight of his original, terrifying form. Resheph's face may have shifted over time, but his presence, his power over disease and death remains. He has not been eradicated. The gods who once walked the earth are not gone. They have simply been absorbed, transformed, hidden in plain sight. They linger in the corners of our world, waiting for the moment when they can reassert their power. Resheph's face may have changed, but he has not truly disappeared. He has simply been obscured, reinterpreted, swallowed up by other, more palatable gods. His power cannot be destroyed, only reshaped. Like the disease he represents, his influence adapts, evolves, and endures. The gods are never truly gone. They're simply waiting, hiding in the form of new faces, new myths, new plagues. And when the world falters, when the need for chaos and destruction arises once again, the face of Resheph will reappear, as it always has, in new forms, ready to claim its place in the world once more. It is a strange, tragic irony. The very nature of gods is to transform, to adapt. And in doing so, they often lose the very essence of what they once were. The faces of gods shift, change, and merge, but their essence, their power is never entirely gone. In some representations, he bore a bow, a weapon of destruction that could strike down those unfortunate enough to fall within his reach. Even after his name was erased, there were remnants of his influence in the stories that emerged. The concept of a god who brings disease and death, yet also has the power to heal, became a part of many later religious frameworks. From the plague of Egypt to the sickness that ravaged the Roman Empire, the myths surrounding disease and divine intervention took on new forms, but they carried the same echo of Resheph's ancient power. Whether it was in the Greek or Roman pantheon, or in the healing rituals of the Christian saints, Resheph's essence could still be felt in the undercurrent of fear and reverence that accompanied every outbreak of illness. His was a power that came with a sweeping tide of pestilence, like the relentless spread of a plague, an unstoppable wave. But over time, this image of Resheph was buried beneath the mask of more agreeable gods. The people of Egypt moved from polytheism to more structured monotheistic systems. And with this shift, Resheph's face was lost to the winds of change. In destruction, he has morphed gradually into other figures, other names, buried under the weight of history. Perhaps his face is not so much hidden as it is obscured, folded into other gods, other dark deities that control not just the fate of the body, but the destiny of the spirit. In Egypt, Resheph had been a god with a well-defined role. But Resheph did not disappear. He found new forms, new faces, and the gods that followed. The most curious transformation of Resheph, however, is not in the gods who absorbed his power, but in the myths that took his place. The nature of Resheph's transformation speaks to a deeper truth about the nature of gods. They are not static. What remains, then, is not a god whose name is forgotten, but one whose name has taken on new forms. The shifting face of Resheph shows how little control humanity truly has over its own fate. As you sit with this thought, you realize that the story of Resheph is not one of death, but of transformation. It is said that gods never truly die, they simply wait. The passage of time may bury them beneath layers of new stories, new beliefs, but the gods are patient. They wait for the right moment when the veil between the known and the air is thick with something unspoken, something ancient, something that calls from the forgotten corners of history. The plagues still come. They come in waves, subtle and unpredictable, ravaging the human race in ways that no one can fully understand. Diseases that seem to spring from nowhere, viruses that emerge out of the blue. Will we see his face, transformed once again by time and history? Or will we continue to deny the gods that once shaped our world, only to be blindsided by their return? And when Resheph returns, as he always does, there will be no hiding, no denying. The world is fragile, more fragile than we care to admit. Resheph's return is not a matter of if, but when. And when it happens, when the plague god rises once again from the shadows, we will be forced to confront the forces of death and destruction that we have spent so long trying to ignore. The gods of chaos and plague do not fade away. They endure, waiting in the silence of history, waiting for the right moment to return and remind us of the power they once held and still hold. The world will be forced to confront the god it has long ignored, to face the reality that no matter how much we change, no matter how much we try to escape the past, the forgotten gods are always watching, always waiting, always ready to reassert their power. And sicknesses that resist all attempts at curing these are the remnants of the forgotten gods, the lingering whispers of Resheph's power. In this modern age of advanced medicine and technology, we have become complacent. We have convinced ourselves that the old gods, the ones who ruled over death and disease, are no longer relevant. We think we have control over our health, over our fate, over our lives. But the truth is far more unsettling. And the forgotten is thin. When the world begins to falter, when the sicknesses, the plagues return, Resheph, once a powerful and feared deity, is not gone. Plague is still a force that cannot be controlled, that cannot be predicted. The names may have changed, the gods may be different, but the power remains the same. Resheph's influence is still felt today, in the sicknesses that spread across the world, in the vulnerability we all feel in the face of disease. No matter how much we try to control it, no matter how much we try to heal it, plague is a force that will always return. He has merely been hidden, concealed beneath the surface of the world, waiting for the right moment to rise again. The modern world, with its scientific understanding and its faith in medicine, may believe that it has banished the old gods to myth. But the truth is darker than that. The old gods never leave, they wait in the background. Their power never fully extinguished, always present, always lurking. The plague god has not gone away. He's merely biding his time, waiting for the right moment to reveal himself once again. Perhaps that moment is now. You can feel it, can't you? We may have banished the gods of old from our temples, erased them from our sacred texts, but we have not erased their influence. The modern world is no different from the ancient world. The question now is not whether Resheph will return, but when. And when he does, will we recognize him? It is said that the return of a forgotten god is always accompanied by chaos, by destruction, by a shift in the very fabric of the world. As you sit with the thought of this return, the weight of it presses on your chest. If your candle hasn't gone out, then you're probably ready for the next god. Resheph's name, once etched in the sacred texts, once whispered in the hidden corners of forgotten temples, is now lost in the corridors of time. The plague god, once so powerful, so feared, has been exiled from human memory. The gods who are cast out, who are hidden away, are not destroyed. No, they endure. He is not a god of fire and fury anymore, not a god of violence or destruction. No, in his exile, Resheph has become a whisper, a shadow, lost to the dust of the ages, is the final proof that some gods cannot be erased. The exile of Resheph is not the end of his story. It is a new beginning. The world may think that it has banished the plague god, but he has merely changed shape. He has retreated into the shadows, into the world of the unspoken, where gods like him are still feared and still worshipped in secret. The plague, the disease, the sickness, they are not the end of the story. They are only the beginning of Resheph's return. They are not gods of permanence, not gods who thrive in the light of worship and praise. They are gods of the unseen, of the unnoticed, of the forces that move through the world quietly, without recognition. Resheph, the plague god, may be forgotten in the grand narrative of history, but his power remains, always present, always there, like the air we breathe, like the blood in our veins. His power has seeped into the unseen corners of existence, where the forces of illness, disease, and decay operate beyond our understanding. He has not disappeared, he has simply hidden himself, biding his time for a moment when the world will once again forget its own fragility. It will be his shadow that you feel as it moves through the streets. The exile of Resheph is not his defeat, it is his persistence, his enduring nature, the proof that even when the gods are forgotten, they are never truly gone. They are simply waiting, hidden in the spaces between the world's memories, waiting for the moment when the veil between the forgotten and the remembered becomes thin enough for them to return. They wait in the shadows in the forgotten places, where the world has no need of them, where their influence is felt only by those who still remember. Even when the world moves on, even when history forgets their names, the gods remain. They endure through the actions of humankind, through sickness, through suffering, through the chaos that we can never fully control. In our attempts to forget them, we only feed them, giving them more power as they slip further into the depths of the human unconscious, into the places where the boundaries between life and death blur. For all of Resheph's exile, for all the erasure of his name, there is still something enduring about him. He was never truly gone. He has merely retreated into the corners of the world, where memory fails, where the gods are no longer needed. His followers, those who once worshipped him in secret, have long faded into obscurity. Their rites and sacrifices reduced to nothing more than shadowed whispers, like ghosts that have forgotten their own names. But there is a strange comfort in exile, isn't there? It is as if exile is a form of protection. The exile of Resheph is not a death, it is a transformation. It is as if the god has become something else, something darker, something more elusive. The final exile of Resheph speaks to the nature of all gods. They are not easily banished, are not easily erased. And so, Resheph's exile is not a punishment, it is his true form. And perhaps, as you reflect on this, you understand something deeper. When the world falters, when the walls of civilization begin to crack, when the plagues return, it will be Resheph's whisper that you hear in the wind. As the candle flickers and dies, the whispered truth remains. There are more gods. There are always more gods. The gods of old, those whose names have been buried in the sand, who have retreated into the shadows, are never truly gone. Like the plague god Resheph, they linger in the spaces between our thoughts, in the darkened corners of our fears, waiting for the moment when the world falters. And as we confront our own mortality, our fragility, the plague god's whisper grows louder, reminding us that no god of plague is ever truly erased. No plague, no disease, no sickness is simply random. They carry with them the whispers of forgotten deities, the ancient powers that shaped our world and still hold sway over our destiny. And as you sit with the knowledge of their return, you begin to understand that the line between the ancient past and the present is not as distinct as we believe. Who else has been forgotten, erased, cast aside, only to return when we least expect it? The gods of destruction, of plague, of transformation, they will always come back. They are not bound by time, by faith, by belief. They endure through silence, through absence, through exile. The moment will come again when we are forced to face them, not as gods of myth, but as the forces we cannot control, the powers that move through us without our understanding. The veil between the forgotten gods and the ones we still worship is thinner than we imagine. And when that veil thins just enough, the gods return not in their old forms, but in new ones, reshaped, hidden, and powerful as ever. When you feel the breath of the wind against your skin, when you see the shadow passing across your path, when the plagues arrive once again, remember this. The forces of chaos and destruction that Resheph once embodied are not gone. They are woven into the fabric of our world, undetectable at times, but always present. And so, you begin to wonder, what other gods are out there, still waiting, still lingering in the corners of the world? If your candle hasn't gone out, and you're probably ready for the next god, the gods will always return. They always have. Or more gods. Or always more gods.